America in the 1860s, a vast wilderness from the Mississippi to the Pacific. The plan? A railroad through 1,600 miles of hostile territory. To build it, men risked avalanches, deadly explosions, Indian attacks, gunfights. In the process, they united a far-flung nation. The Transcontinental Railroad, next on Modern Marvels.
America's Wild West, an untamed land symbolizing freedom, opportunity, wealth. In the middle of the 19th century, it was as exotic a frontier as outer space is today. The cry of gold in California triggered an extraordinary stampede of fortune seekers from all corners of the world. When California became a state in 1850, America dreamed of uniting the remote West with the East. But there was one hitch. The journey across the continent was like a slow waltz to the moon. Travelers had to endure one of three miserable, life-threatening choices. Riding on horseback for a month through the malaria-infested jungles of the Panama Isthmus. A 4-month sea voyage around Cape Horn, or several harrowing months crossing the American frontier by wagon, horse, or foot.
At the beginning of the railway age in this country, in the 1830s and 40s, our transportation took place at roughly the same, in the same manner as it had in ancient Rome. We still moved things by animal power at 4 miles an hour, or at best in a sailing ship. The railroads changed that. And very suddenly, we were able to go 20, 30, 40 miles per hour. We were able to cover in one day the distance it used to take a week or longer to go.
Invented in England in 1825, the steam engine was first imported a year later to America and put to use in the Pennsylvania coalfields. By the 1850s, the railroad annihilated distances at 25 miles per hour throughout the East and all the way to the Mississippi River. Roughly 10,000 miles of track linked cities on the east side of the river by 1853. But it was a terrifying iron monster, dirty, dangerous, and often fatal. The technology of steam made explosions, breakdowns, and fires a terrifying reality. Despite the flaws, some people envisioned the railroad as the key to westward expansionism. But a railroad all the way to the Pacific seemed to be an impossibility. 1,600 grueling miles of vast, empty space separated Kansas City, the railroad's westernmost stop, from the Pacific. In between were two massive mountain barriers, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra. Peaks towering over 14,000 feet and a scorching hot desert. The dream of building a transcontinental railroad became an all-consuming obsession for two young men, two ambitious civil engineers. One lived in California, the other on the East Coast. Although they never met, they shared the same passionate belief. Before he was 28, Ted Judah had already engineered the spectacular Niagara Gorge Railroad in New York. But his vivid imagination and optimism drove him to conjure up the grandest railroad of all. The biggest obstacle was finding a route through the difficult, seemingly impassable Sierra Nevada mountain range.
He knew it could be done, and he devoted every waking hour and every increment of his energy to convincing others that it was possible. And it got to the point where people would literally cross the street to avoid confronting him on a sidewalk. He was known as Crazy Judah and called that to his face.
Crazy Judah set out to the Sierra on horseback. With him, he took his notebooks to record a path across the mountains. But after months of fruitless searching, he ran into a dead end. Frustrated to the point of despair, he received a letter that would dramatically change everything.
Dr. Daniel Strong, a druggist and physician from Dutch Flat, had done surveying work himself for a wagon road in the area, and he pointed out to Judah in a letter that there was a natural inclined plane, a ramp, which would allow Judah to connect his surveyed route with a line that would carry him over the mountains at Donner Lake. This was an exciting discovery, and it really transformed Judah's harebrained scheme into an idea that would really be something that could be achieved.
The following summer, Judah returned to the Sierra and completed a brilliant survey. He located an extraordinary series of ridges that could carry a rail line through the Sierra and then down to Nevada. While Judah continued his survey, another visionary in the East dreamed of a transcontinental railroad. As a high-strung, driven young man, Grenville Dodge rebelled against the confines of New England society types, declaring, "They are a stench to my nostrils." Dodge confided his dream to his sister.
Soon you'll be whirled along by steam, never dreaming that 4 years before it was a wild open country inhabited only by wild beasts and the red man.
Dodge risked his life to prove it could be done. Secretly, he ventured into Indian territory to survey a rail line. But back on the East Coast, no one bought his dream. When the Civil War broke out, Dodge wrangled a colonel's commission in the Union Army, but the railroad would remain his obsession. Back in Sacramento, Ted Judah had more luck persuading 4 merchants to finance his dream. They would be known to history as the Big Four of California. Charles Crocker was a crude, loud, hard-drinking giant with fiery red hair who owned a dry goods store. Charles P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins operated the largest hardware enterprise on the Pacific coast. Huntington had come to California to mine for gold, but gave it up after only 1 morning of digging. Hopkins was a soft-spoken vegetarian who knew how to drive a shrewd bargain. The 4th member, Leland Stanford, longed to become governor and would get his wish sooner than even he imagined.
They were all involved with Republican politics. They were abolitionists. They were interested in making sure California stayed connected with the Union. They were also shrewd Yankee businessmen who knew a business opportunity when they saw it.
The Big Four and Judah began the Central Pacific Railroad on the 2nd floor of Huntington and Hopkins' hardware store. Judah was sent to Washington as an accredited agent of the Central Pacific. Ted Judah helped Congress draft the Pacific Railroad Act that established 2 companies, Central Pacific to build east from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific to build west from Omaha. The timing was perfect. The year was 1862, and with the outbreak of the Civil War, congressmen were anxious to see the railroad built quickly.
For Abraham Lincoln, the creation of the Pacific Railroad was not so much a commercial act or an act of technology as it was a political act. We had to connect the East with the West in the same way as Lincoln was trying to preserve the North and the South as one country.
The government agreed to loan companies up to $48,000 per mile of track built and turn over land grants running alongside the railroad route. For each mile of rail completed, the companies would be awarded 20 square miles of land. It was a fortune in real estate. And since no meeting point was determined for the 2 competing railroads, the owners of the Central Pacific in the west and the Union Pacific in the east got set for a race to see who could fling the most track across the country. In Sacramento, this urgency suited the Big Four's entrepreneurial appetite. But even before the work started, the Big Four and Judah came to loggerheads as to how their railroad would be built. They wanted to build it as quickly and cheaply as possible, and Judah fought for quality. Feeling betrayed, Judah headed east, hoping to find new financial support to buy his partners out. In a hurry, Judah took the 30-day shortcut to the East Coast through the Isthmus of Panama, an overland crossing before the canal was built. But on his journey through the jungles, he contracted yellow fever. 5 days after reaching New York, Judah died before seeing a single spike driven into a rail. The Big Four now controlled Judah's vision and set out to fully exploit it. But ahead of them lay pitfalls they hadn't even thought about. Like, where in the world could they find 5,000 men who would devote their heart and soul and risk their lives to build such an impossible railroad?
Railroads receiving land grants had to haul government cargo at reduced rates. When this agreement ended in 1946, the railroads had repaid an estimated 10 times the value of the land. We'll be right back with Transcontinental Railroad on Modern Marvels.
In 1863, the two pioneering companies chosen by Congress to build the first transcontinental railroad broke ground. They were like two competing armies getting ready for the unknown. The Central Pacific launched from Sacramento. The Union Pacific launched from Omaha, Nebraska. Co-owner Charlie Crocker, the hard-drinking giant, filled the role as the railroad's construction chief.
He was not, by training or nature, prepared to build a railroad across the mountains, but he possessed a rare common sense, a gift of leading men. And he knew enough engineering to be able to size up a situation, know what materials he needed, and actually make it happen. It very much resembled a military operation. Vast numbers of men with relatively simple tools mobilized in squads and divisions and groups who went out to conquer the mountains.
But recruiting the muscle to move mountains was a problem that plagued Charlie Crocker from the beginning. Most men were fighting in the war or working in the silver mines, and able-bodied workers were tough to find. Crocker advertised throughout California for 5,000 willing men, trying to lure applicants with permanent employment. But he was lucky if he got more than 800 enlistees. The labor shortage was not his only worry. The sheer volume of construction materials was phenomenal. In the coming years, the two railroad companies would need to utilize more than 3 million ties, hundreds of tons of gunpowder, and over 140,000 tons of rail. Wooden ties were honed in local sawmills, but everything else had to be imported from the East Coast. That meant every locomotive, spike, rail, and keg of black powder would take from 5 to 8 months to be shipped by sea to San Francisco, and then ferried to Sacramento. From there, everything had to be hauled up into the Sierra by horse or oxen. At the site, surveyors would calculate the cuts and fills. Then the graders would lower mountains, fill valleys, and establish a level roadbed. The track-laying crews followed the graders with the track material: the rails, cross ties, spikes, bolts, and rail joint bars called fish plates. 4 or 5 men would be needed to take off a 650-pound rail and drop it down. Once one rail was laid, a person with a track gauge, essentially a piece of wood 4 feet 8.5 inches long, came to measure the distance for placing the second rail. A good crew could lay a rail every 30 seconds. Then the spike drivers came along and set and drove all the spikes in. They made quick progress at first across the flat Sacramento Valley. But only 20 miles east of Sacramento, crews reached the foothills of the Sierra and confronted their first big engineering challenge: to build a 400-foot wooden trestle across a steep ravine. The Newcastle Trestle was just the beginning of many bridges in the wilderness. Early trestles were amazing feats of engineering. Built entirely of wood and iron bolts, work began with stone masonry footings built in the riverbed or ravine. Trestle builders would lift pre-cut timbers up onto the footings and assemble pieces into a row. Row upon row would be tied together with timber. At the top went the ties, then the rails. Erecting trestles was complicated enough, But Crocker's real challenge was solving his labor shortage that was getting even more critical as the work got harder. The only available men that he could find were the Chinese, who had come to California to work in the gold mines. There they encountered tremendous racial discrimination and were barred from mining gold. Anti-Chinese sentiment ran so deep in those days that Crocker only hired them as a last resort.
Everybody scoffed at Charlie Crocker because he hired a few of the Chinese to test them out and see how good they were. And they said, oh, they're too short, they're too small in stature, they can't do that kind of work. And they were soon proved wrong.
They turned out to be so good that soon Crocker and his Central Pacific hired all of the available Chinese in California, and even had labor contractors recruit workers from southern China. By 1865, 6,000 Chinese worked on the railroad. They carved and blasted away at the ridges of the Sierra foothills, using horse-drawn dump carts to haul off earth and rock debris. The Chinese workers lived separately from the other workers and even hired their own cook.
They would eat their traditional foods, which tended to be high in vegetables, good for you. They boiled their water in the form of tea, which made the Chinese nearly immune to the kind of bacterial infections that the European laborers would experience. They didn't squander their checks on payday. They didn't go on three-day drunks. In many respects, they were considered by the railroad to be the ideal labor force.
In the years ahead, the Central Pacific would have as many as 12,000 men working along miles of line at one time. 90% of the Central Pacific labor force was Chinese. But progress was bitterly slow. In the first 3 years between 1863 and 1866, the Central Pacific only advanced 40 miles. The Big Four had spent $8 million and were struggling to pay their bills. Charlie Crocker complained.
I would gladly have traded all I had for the debts I owed and started all over again and never heard of the Pacific Railroad.
In the East, the Union Pacific wasn't doing much better. Their job of building from Omaha, Nebraska westward across the gentler flat prairie should have been simple. But after 3 years, they also had only laid 40 miles of track. With the end of the Civil War, the Union Pacific's fate changed dramatically. Its ranks were flooded with war veterans who had just fought each other. Freed slaves, Irishmen, Germans, Mormons, and a sprinkling of Chinese. Men in blue coats and gray coats dug trenches, moved earth, and sweated for $1 a day. Having just fought in the war, they were hardened to living outdoors, surviving on beans and hardtack, and encountering dangers on a daily basis. They couldn't have been more different from the shrewd financiers in charge of the Union Pacific. Thomas Durant, a former medical school graduate who turned to business, was more obsessed with lining his pockets than building a railroad. From the start, he had accepted bribes. He had already spent $500,000 on the railroad with little to show for it. To rescue his company, Durant tapped the young visionary General Grenville Dodge, who 9 years before had surveyed the eastern path of the railroad. He was hired at the handsome salary of $10,000 a year to be chief engineer.
Dodge was a railroader, but then he was a soldier. And at the close of the Civil War, his job in the Army as a general was basically to clean out the West, to subjugate the Indians and make the way safe for the Union Pacific Railroad. He maintained a rather brutal, very direct policy of forcing the Native Americans onto the reservations, of in many cases exterminating entire tribes who he thought were in the way.
But if Dodge and his Union Pacific were ever to lay track across the empty 1,000-mile expanse before them, they would have to invent a city on wheels, the likes of which the world had never seen.
Union Pacific paid Buffalo Bill Cody $500 a month to provide a daily supply of buffalo meat for their workers. It took 12 buffalo per day to feed 1,200 men. Modern Marvels will return.
I ain't never coming back, and I'll never get no letter from my home. But if my woman says so.
To build the railroad took more than man muscle and sweat. It took a tough, bold new breed of modern management, invented by the Union Pacific. Neither of the Casement brothers was taller than 5'4", but they were organizational dynamos. Hired to run the Union Pacific track gangs, they revolutionized railroad building. The older brother John was a famous general who had been a foreman of a track building gang. His younger brother Dan, who stood 5 feet tall, looked like a 12-year-old boy requiring a large hat.
They were tough. They were hard on their men, but they would do anything their men would do. And so that made their men really respect them highly.
What lay ahead was one of the most dangerous tasks imaginable. How to build and supply a single track pushing out across hundreds of miles of the western plains under threat of Indian attack. To solve the problem, the Casements invented the work train. This was an astonishing innovation, a city on wheels that functioned as the nerve center of the whole operation. The locomotive pushed, not pulled, 20 or more cars, each tailor-made for building and living on the tracks. There was a car fitted with tools, a blacksmith shop, a dining car, a kitchen, dormitories with built-in bunks, housing about 50 men per car. Bringing up the rear were several flat cars loaded with road-building supplies. One surprising cargo was a storeroom with hundreds of loaded rifles in case of an Indian attack.
They carried everything with them on the train, all their supplies, all their food, and except for meat. And of course they had hunters that went out and killed the buffalo, antelope, deer, whatever they could find. So they were completely self-contained.
One of the biggest supply problems was getting lumber for making ties and building bridges. With no timber on the high plains, the wood had to come from the forests of Minnesota and travel hundreds of miles down rivers and by wagon. Once they orchestrated the supply line, the track layers quickly advanced across the Nebraska plains, laying about a mile of track a day. One reporter on the scene in 1866 described the intense activity.
4 men seize a rail, less than 30 seconds to a rail, and so 4 rails go down to the minute. It is a grand anvil chorus, 3 strokes to the spikes, 10 spikes to the rail, 400 rails to the mile, 1,800 miles to San Francisco.
Working and living at the end of the track wasn't exactly fun.
Up at dawn, no heat, no hot water, no place to bathe or shave, into the dining car with long trestle tables. You're using the same utensils and flatware that the person before you had used and the person after you would follow with. You'd share a cup. The rudest and most miserable of food, and then on out to the end of track. And you'd work all day with a sandwich, which might consist of a piece of bread and a hunk of meat, and water or beer or coffee. And then you'd come back worn out, exhausted, and into the racks, packed into a dormitory car with perhaps 50 other men who also had not bathed that month and who would get up the next morning to do the whole process again.
The men on the front line faced dangers in handling the volume of materials. Accidents happened all the time.
If a man was seriously hurt, there was not much hope for him. Thousands of miles from the nearest hospital. The best the railroad could do was offer him an honorable death.
But the most horrifying danger the Union Pacific faced was human. Indians on the warpath. The Sioux and the Cheyenne witnessed the advancing track with rage. The treaties that had protected Indian land in Nebraska and Wyoming were quickly being annulled. At stake was a way of life they had practiced for hundreds of years. In retaliation, war parties raided the Union Pacific's trains, ripped up rails and tore down telegraph wires. Further west, the Central Pacific was left alone. Most attacks were aimed at the Union Pacific's isolated advance teams, such as the surveyors and bridge builders.
General Dodge was not above staging rather dramatic Indian attacks or taking advantage when a government inspector or politician happened to be in harm's way when the roving bands of Plains Indians made demonstrations against the railroad. He managed to convince General Sherman that thousands of additional troops were needed, and he did indeed, in the end, superintend the extermination of the Plains Indians from their historic lands.
General Sherman, an Indian fighter during the Civil War, gave the railroads his full support.
The more we can kill this year, the less we'll have to be killed the next. But the more I see of these Indians, the more convinced I am that they all have to be killed. General Sherman, 1872.
One way the railroads and the military attacked the Native Americans was to slaughter the buffalo, which they depended on for their existence. Over 12 million buffalo roamed the West when work began on the railroad. Sometimes a single herd would blanket the vast landscape as far as the eye could see. The railroad companies hired sharpshooters to kill countless thousands of buffalo on the Great Plains to make way for the train. One Indian chief pleaded for the killing to stop.
Listen well. Your young men have destroyed the fine timber and the green grass and have burnt up the country. They have killed my game and my buffalo. They did not kill them to eat. They left them to rot where they fell. Were I to go kill your cattle, what would you say? Would that not be wrong and cause war? Crow Chief, Bear's Tooth, 1867.
His cry went unheeded. By the end of 1867, the Union Pacific had spent 4 years working on the rails, and despite the Indians, the elements, and the supply problems, they had laid 300 miles of track. Their rivals, the Central Pacific, had advanced less than 80 miles. They were stuck in the Sierra Mountains of California, facing a challenge even more monumental: how to stay alive while blasting a half-mile tunnel with handmade nitroglycerin. High up in the Sierra, the workers on the Central Pacific were trying to devise a way to build a rail line through solid granite. To cross the Sierra, Crocker's Chinese crews needed to bore through 15 mountains. They had no mechanized tunneling equipment and no modern explosives. They only had the basics: handheld iron drills, sledgehammers, and black powder. Before there was a tunnel, first there had to be a drill hole for blasting, and it was no easy task. Each hole had to be about 12 inches deep. Drills had to be reshaped and sharpened by a blacksmith every few hours. The depth of the hole was extremely critical. If it was too shallow, the explosion would blow backwards with the force of a cannon. To speed up the blasting, work crews chipped away at both ends of the tunnel around the clock. But even then, the progress was often only 8 inches every 24 hours. The greatest engineering challenge would be the Summit Tunnel that had to penetrate the pinnacle of the Sierra Nevada, overlooking Donner Lake. At 6,000 feet above sea level, they needed to build a tunnel measuring 20 feet high that would run over 1,600 feet through granite. Even with Crocker's army of 6,000 Chinese workers, the work was projected to take 3 years to complete. Drilling and blasting was painfully slow in good weather, but winter proved far more disastrous than anyone had ever imagined. Major snowstorms in the Sierras brought work to a standstill. The winter of 1867 through 1868 broke all records with 44 storms, some dumping as much as 6 feet of snow, with drifts as high as a 4-story building. Charlie Crocker was faced with a mind-blowing challenge that no one had planned for: what to do with the raw physical force of millions of tons of snow. The previous winter, the Central Pacific built its first snowplow, measuring 30 feet, with the front end crafted like the prow of a battleship, and weighted with pig iron to keep it on track. As many as 12 locomotives were needed to move the snow a little. At worst, the locomotives derailed from the massive impact of the snow, and men were killed. The crews lived and worked for months under the snow. They had to cut passageways between their wooden shacks and the tunnel entrance.
It's difficult to imagine the hardships that faced these men in those winters when they literally lived beneath the snow like moles, when they melted snow for drinking water, when they were cold constantly, when sometimes the only daylight they saw was when they poked a hole in the roof of these snow caverns. They worked in tunnels, they worked in darkness.
In the worst storms, food and supplies couldn't reach the summit. Work crews survived on meager emergency rations, sometimes for weeks. The workers suffered from pneumonia, frostbite, and malnutrition. Men were terrified of avalanches that without warning would crash down on their shelters and bury people alive. The bodies weren't found until the snow thawed in the spring. The snow was such a colossal problem that at one time 9,000 workers were needed to clear the tracks with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. The workers often took weeks just to clear cuts of ice, sometimes 15 feet thick over the tracks. Meanwhile, the crews inside the tunnel labored around the clock, consuming as many as 500 kegs of blasting powder a day.
Blasting was done with black powder, the ancient Chinese formula of charcoal and sulfur and saltpeter, but it was a very inefficient explosive. The granite was so hard that the powder would literally blast out of the holes and not fracture the rock. So a new synthetic explosive, nitroglycerin, was experimented with.
Nitroglycerin had been invented only a few years before by Ascanio Sobrero in Italy. The compound was so volatile that the Central Pacific hired a chemist to mix a fresh batch every morning in a special kitchen near the worksite. With nitroglycerin, the work now moved twice as quickly but was far more lethal than black powder. Crocker eventually stopped using it. On August 29, 1867, 1 year after work began, the summit tunnel was finished ahead of schedule. 3 months later, supply trains were running through it towards Nevada. The 1,600-foot tunnel was the longest in the world at that time. A modern marvel in engineering and human endurance. Meanwhile, the men of the Union Pacific were drinking whiskey and gambling in the wilderness.
It don't make a damn wherever we land. We hit her up for joy.
As the Union Pacific stretched west into the barren territory of Wyoming, the railroad created makeshift towns called Hell on Wheels. They were notorious, and Cheyenne, Wyoming was as big and as bad as any of them. With 6,000 inhabitants, it was a place where, as one man wrote his wife, vice and crime stalk unblushingly in the midday sun.
They had every form of entertainment and vice that you could ever imagine, because the company felt that was a way to keep their men happy. There were gambling halls, houses of prostitution, and saloons, obviously. In fact, the Union Pacific probably lost more men from gunfights than they did actually from accidents.
Despite these moments of levity, the Union Pacific work crew stormed west. At Dale Creek in eastern Wyoming, bridge builders amazingly nailed together a temporary framework of timber 650 feet long and 130 feet high in 30 days. It was the biggest trestle work on the Union Pacific line. The bridge was so fragile and dangerous that it swayed when the winds blew up the canyon. Inspectors refused to sign off on it until Durant promised to lash it down with cables and replace it with an iron structure within a year. Over 1,000 miles west, the rival construction crew still battled with the forces of nature. Once the Central Pacific cleared the Sierra, Crocker had hoped it would be smooth sailing through Nevada, but no such luck. The winter problem in the Sierra continued to block their supplies from getting through, causing huge delays in the track building. In desperation, Charlie Crocker came up with an amazing solution. He ordered his men to construct 40 miles of timber-roof snow sheds over the most mountainous stretches of track. These sheds would end up needing 65 million feet of timber, 900 tons of bolts and spikes, and ended up costing the Central Pacific Company $2 million. In early April 1868, the Central Pacific crews had inched through the toughest mountains on the rail line. In 6 years, they had only spiked 119 miles of track. But it was the most difficult line ever built in the world. The Union Pacific had completed 540 miles across far more gentle territory, but they now faced their most formidable challenge, the kinds of mountainous terrain that the Central Pacific had faced, the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming and the Wasatch Range in Utah. But nature was good to them. To cross the Rockies, the Union Pacific only had to bore 4 tunnels, but ahead lay a battle with the wilderness that was to be every bit as torturous as the Central Pacific struggle with the Sierra. The desert of Wyoming and Utah was like a stark, uninhabitable moonscape. One of the biggest problems was not the threat of Indian or animal attack, but finding water, an element essential to steam locomotives. An engine back then would need 1,000 gallons of water to go 15 miles. Water tanks were built every 14 miles along the line. When railroaders did manage to find a well, they would use a windmill to pump the water.
They would pump the water by wind power into a tank, and then when the locomotive came by, they could lower a spout down into the tender and fill it with water. But it was not always that easy. For many spots, they didn't have reliable wind power. Some spots, they had to actually set up a steam-driven pump to pump water out of the well.
In places where the railroads pioneered water technology, towns sprang up. In many parts of the desert where there was no water, the railroad had to haul their water in huge tank cars. Long water trains would make daily runs to dump water into cisterns, which were pumped into the trackside tank. Despite it all, the Union Pacific kept moving. It was now February 1869, nearly 6 years since construction began. With the Union Pacific by now approaching Salt Lake City, the Central Pacific had raced halfway across Nevada and was moving quickly toward Utah. The race was heating up. With the connecting point still not determined, the railroad owners wanted to build as many miles of track as possible to collect government land grants and loans. Ahead of them was a sprint to the finish line, fought by everyone from the lowliest spikeman to the richest railroad baron, while the country waited for the outcome.
Due to the difficulty of crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains, most in Congress originally believed that the Central Pacific would be lucky to meet the Union Pacific at the eastern California border. Modern marvels will continue in a moment.
Spring of 1869. As the armies raced to reach the prospering Mormon communities in Utah's Salt Lake Valley, an incredibly bizarre development took place. With no predetermined connecting point, the two competing grading crews literally graded roadbeds past each other for over 250 miles, each laying claim to the right-of-way. The government ordered the railroads to fix a meeting point, or we'll do it for you. Grenville Dodge and Collis Huntington met in Washington and hammered out a compromise. Both companies would profit from the Salt Lake City traffic. The tracks would join the following month at Promontory Summit, Utah. With no more subsidies being issued, the race was officially over. But the track layers didn't slow down.
As the tracks drew closer together and it became apparent that the Pacific Railroad was going to be a reality and not just a dream, they began feeling that they were truly part of a great national work. They began to know that they were doing something that would outlive them, outlast them, that even down to the most anonymous man with a shovel in his hands, this was going to be a work for the ages, and they had a part in it.
As the two lines moved toward Promontory, one of the world's most amazing bets was wagered. The Central Pacific's Charlie Crocker had once boasted to Thomas Durant, the head of the Union Pacific, that his men could lay 10 miles of track in a single day. Durant staked $10,000 that it was impossible. Crocker chose April 28th to be 10 Mile Day. For the hand-picked team of Crocker's workers, this event was the ultimate test of endurance. The day began with Chinese workers shuttling iron on horse-drawn handcars to a crew of 8 Irish rail carriers and the track-laying team. They worked without a break and refused to eat a lunch. The track moved forward at a rate of almost a mile an hour. In 12 hours, the Central Pacific workers spiked 10 miles and 56 feet of track and lifted over 2 million pounds of iron rail, a record that still stands today. For their feat, they were given 4 days' pay. As the crews neared Promontory, plans were underway for a ceremony celebrating the joining of the lines, the moment that the nation had been waiting for. 2 brand new trains with railroad officials set out from Omaha and Sacramento to meet at the finish line.
The scene at Promontory that May 10th was one of contrast. The grizzled veterans of this incredible campaign, in their dusty clothes, with their calloused hands, with the leadership of the railroads in their fancy private cars, with their champagne and their fresh fruits. The contrast was striking.
Western Union stood by to signal the moment the last spike was driven. Like the Apollo landing on the moon, virtually all of America waited for the news. At 11:15 a.m., the Central Pacific's Jupiter pulled forward to the Union Pacific's number 119, each crowded with exuberant, exhausted workers. The ceremony called for Thomas Durant, the head of the Union Pacific, and Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, to drive not 1 golden spike, as legend has it, but 4 spikes. 2 gold, 1 silver, and the 4th a mixture of gold, silver, and iron.
Governor Stanford stepped up, made 1 huge swing and missed the spike and hit the tie. A huge roar of laughter went up from the workers who had probably driven several 100,000 spikes in their career. So then they offered the spike maul to Dr. Durant, who had apparently a slight hangover, and he couldn't even hit the spike at all, and he hit the dirt. And they finally had to hand the spike maul to a worker of the railroad who drove it home.
The telegraph operator tapped out the message, "Done." That was transmitted within seconds around the country. The nation was ecstatic. Cannons were fired, whistles blew, and parades marched down Main Street. The dream of a united nation, coast to coast, was finally realized. The first transcontinental railroad ended up taking 6 years to complete, coming in ahead of schedule. Even to this day, no one knows exactly how many men sacrificed their lives. The 2 railroad companies were awarded a total of almost 21 million acres, more land than Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont combined. Theodore Judah's wildest dream had been realized. 6 years later, a painting of the ceremony at Promontory included him in tribute. Grenville Dodge would have more railroad challenges in the years ahead, but nothing would compare to this glory.
Closing the tracks at Promontory was in many ways the last act in creating the United States. And it was just the beginning of a new period, a new set of actors, a new set of tools, a new set of values that would radically remake, would completely transform the world they lived in and give us the world we exist in today.